The day my neighbor sued me over my own driveway, I honestly thought it was some kind of joke. Not because the lawsuit was funny, but because the reason behind it was so ridiculous that no reasonable person should have been willing to sign their name to it. According to him, he had a legal right to use my driveway because he'd been doing it for years. There was only one problem with that argument. The driveway didn't even exist when he claimed he started using it. My name is Ryan Mercer, and a few years ago, I bought a small ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Falls, Iowa. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was mine. After years of working overtime as a project manager for a construction company, saving every extra dollar I could, I finally had enough to buy a property where I could sit on my back porch in the evening and hear birds instead of traffic. That was the dream anyway. For the first year, everything was exactly what I hoped it would be. The neighborhood was peaceful. Most people kept to themselves. Everyone waved when they drove by. Nobody caused problems. Then there was my neighbor, Randall Bishop. Randall lived directly across from me. He was one of those guys who somehow managed to make every conversation about himself. If you mentioned a fishing trip, he'd tell you about a bigger fish he caught. If you talked about fixing your roof, he'd explain how he could have done it cheaper. He wasn't exactly a bad guy at first, just exhausting. Looking back now, I think that's why I ignored the early warning signs. It started with something so small it barely registered. Every now and then, Randall would back into my driveway, swing his truck around, and head back down the road. The street ended in a narrow cul-de-sac that wasn't particularly convenient, so I figured he was just taking a shortcut. The first few times, I didn't care. Honestly, if someone needs 10 seconds of my driveway to turn around, what difference does it make? That's how most people think. We all make little accommodations for neighbors. It's part of living in a community. But then those 10 seconds became a daily routine. Every morning before work, I'd hear the rumble of Randall's pickup, followed by the crunch of tires as he rolled halfway up my driveway before swinging back out. Every afternoon, the same thing. Every evening, the same thing again. At first I shrugged it off. Then I started noticing something strange. It wasn't just Randall anymore. One Saturday morning, I looked out my kitchen window and saw his son doing it. A few days later, one of his relatives pulled into my driveway to turn around. Then a delivery van did it. Then another. A landscaping trailer came through one afternoon and cut across the edge of my lawn so sharply that it left 2 muddy trenches in the grass I'd spent months trying to restore. That was the moment something shifted inside me, because it wasn't really about the driveway anymore. It was about boundaries. There's a difference between a favor and an expectation. A favor is something you choose to give. An expectation is something someone decides they're entitled to take. And Randall had clearly crossed that line. The thing that bothered me most wasn't the tire tracks or the headlights flashing through my living room window at night. It was the attitude. Every person who used my driveway acted like it belonged to them. Nobody asked. Nobody waved. Nobody apologized. They simply assumed access was theirs. One evening I was mowing my lawn when Randall pulled into the driveway again. This time I walked over before he could leave. I wasn't angry. At least not yet. I remember wiping sweat from my forehead and saying, "Hey Randall, would you mind not using the driveway to turn around anymore?" He looked genuinely confused. Why? I laughed a little because I thought he was joking. Because it's my driveway. He stared at me for a second before shrugging. "Come on, Ryan. It's not hurting anything." "Maybe not," I said, "but I'd still rather people stay off the property." His expression changed instantly. The friendly neighbor disappeared. In his place was a man who looked personally offended that someone had told him no. He gave a short laugh. "Relax. Everybody uses it." "No," I said. "You use it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away without another word. I should have known that conversation wasn't over. People like Randall rarely accept boundaries gracefully. They see boundaries as challenges. The next weekend, I installed a small sign near the entrance of the driveway. Nothing aggressive, nothing rude, just a simple black sign with white letters that said private driveway. No turnaround. That was it. No threats. No warnings. No drama. And surprisingly, it worked. For nearly 2 weeks, nobody used the driveway. No trucks. No delivery vans. No surprise visitors. The silence felt wonderful. I remember sitting on my porch one evening thinking the problem had finally solved itself. I couldn't have been more wrong, because 14 days later, a man wearing a Navy suit walked up my front steps carrying a large envelope. And the moment I saw him, I had a feeling my quiet little driveway dispute was about to become something much bigger. The man introduced himself as a process server. The second he said those words, my stomach dropped. I'd never been sued before. Most people haven't. It's one of those things you see on television, but never really expect to experience yourself. I signed the paperwork, closed the door, carried the envelope into my kitchen, and sat at the table staring at it for a full minute before opening it. Part of me expected it to be some misunderstanding, maybe a clerical error, maybe somebody with the same last name. Instead, the very first page made it clear exactly what was happening. Randall Bishop was suing me. According to the complaint, my sign was unlawfully interfering with his access rights. He claimed he had established historical usage of the driveway over many years and that I had unfairly blocked access that he and his family had relied upon for over a decade. Then it got even better. He wanted the sign removed. He wanted permanent access restored. And he wanted financial compensation for the inconvenience I had caused him. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes something is so absurd your brain doesn't know how else to react. Then I kept reading. The more I read, the less funny it became. Because somebody had clearly spent money putting this nonsense together. Somebody had filed paperwork. Somebody had gone through an actual legal process. Randall wasn't bluffing. He genuinely believed he was going to force me to let him use my property forever. I called my friend Kevin that night. We'd known each other since college. After hearing the situation, he was silent for about 5 seconds before saying, "Ryan, please tell me you're making this up." "I wish I was." "He sued you because he can't use your driveway to turn around?" That's basically the summary. Kevin laughed so hard he nearly choked. But after the laughter faded, he asked an important question. Does he actually have any legal claim? I have no idea. That question bothered me all night. Because even though the lawsuit sounded ridiculous, lawsuits cost money. They take time. They create stress. And sometimes ridiculous people win things they shouldn't. The next morning I called an attorney named Melissa Grant. She specialized in property disputes and had a reputation for being both practical and brutally honest. During our first meeting, she listened quietly while I explained everything. When I finished, she folded her hands and asked, "How long have you owned the property?" "Almost 5 years." "And when was the driveway built?" 4 years ago during a renovation. That got her attention. 4 years ago? Yeah. She leaned back slightly. Then how exactly is he claiming 10 years of historical usage? That's what I'm trying to figure out. For the first time, I saw the corner of her mouth twitch. Not quite a smile. More like someone spotting a very large crack in an opponent's argument. "Let's start with records," she said. "If he's claiming a legal right, there should be evidence somewhere." Over the next several weeks, we started digging. At first, I assumed the process would be simple. Check the deed. Confirm ownership. End of story. Instead, I learned just how much information exists about a piece of property. City records, survey maps, building permits, tax documents, historical aerial photographs, utility plans, easements, development records. It felt like uncovering an archaeological history of my own backyard. The first major discovery came from county archives. Melissa pulled up aerial photographs taken periodically over the years. We started scrolling backward through time. There was my house. There was my yard. There was my property line. And there was absolutely no driveway. Year after year, nothing but grass. Green lawn. Open yard. No pavement. No gravel. No concrete. Nothing. Then we reached photographs from 4 years earlier. Construction equipment appeared. Temporary materials appeared. Work crews appeared. Finally, after months of renovation, the driveway appeared for the very first time. Melissa stared at the screen for several seconds. Then she looked at me and said, "Well, that's pretty important. You think, Ryan, your neighbor is claiming historical rights to something that literally didn't exist." That sentence stayed in my head, because suddenly the entire case looked different. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion. Randall either knew the truth and lied anyway, or he had convinced himself that using something long enough somehow transformed it into his property. Neither explanation reflected well on him. We kept investigating. The deed revealed no shared access agreements, no easements, no rights of way, no recorded permissions. The survey maps confirmed the same thing. Every inch of the driveway sat entirely inside my property boundaries. There wasn't a single legal document supporting Randall's position. As our evidence grew stronger, something else started happening around the neighborhood. People began hearing about the lawsuit. Small communities have a way of spreading information faster than the internet. At the grocery store, people started asking questions. At the gas station, people mentioned it casually. Most reactions were identical. Confusion followed by disbelief. One afternoon, an elderly neighbor named Walter stopped me while I was checking my mailbox. Walter had lived on the street for almost 30 years. If anyone knew neighborhood history, it was him. Heard about the lawsuit, Walter said. Yeah. Walter shook his head. That driveway wasn't there when you bought the place. I know. Wasn't there before you bought it either. I know. Walter laughed. Then what's he suing about? Apparently history. Walter stared for a moment before bursting into laughter so hard he had to grab the mailbox for support. Well, he finally said, wiping tears from his eyes, that's going to be an interesting history lesson. The closer we got to court, the more confident Randall seemed to become. Every time I saw him outside, he carried himself like a man who had already won. One afternoon, he actually waved at me from across the street. Not a friendly wave, a smug wave. The kind of wave someone gives when they think they're holding a winning lottery ticket. It irritated me more than I wanted to admit, because despite the evidence, part of me remained nervous. Courtrooms are unpredictable places. Logic doesn't always feel as secure when you're sitting in front of a judge. The hearing finally arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. The courthouse wasn't particularly large, but walking inside still felt intimidating. Melissa met me near security and reviewed our evidence one last time. Aerial photographs, property records, building permits, surveys, everything neatly organized. Relax, she told me. Facts are facts. Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one being sued over a driveway. When we entered the courtroom, Randall was already there. He sat beside his attorney, looking unusually pleased with himself. He nodded at me as though we were business partners about to finalize a deal. That confidence worried me. Confident people make others doubt themselves. The hearing began. The judge was an older man named Harold Brennan. He had the kind of calm expression that revealed absolutely nothing. Not approval, not annoyance, not curiosity, nothing. He listened patiently as Randall's attorney presented the case. The argument sounded almost reasonable if you ignored reality. Years of use, established expectations, community reliance, historical access. Every phrase sounded impressive until you actually examined it. Then came a moment that changed everything. Judge Brennan looked directly at Randall and asked a simple question. Mr. Bishop, approximately how long have you been using this driveway? Randall sat up straighter in his chair. He sounded proud when he answered. At least 10 years, Your Honor. The second those words left his mouth, I saw Melissa reach for the presentation remote. And although nobody else in the room realized it yet, the entire lawsuit had just stepped directly into a trap. I didn't fully understand what Melissa was about to do until she stood up and walked toward the display screen. Up to that point, the hearing had felt tense, uncertain, like one of those moments where you know you're right, but you're still waiting for somebody else to recognize it. Then she pressed a button on the remote. The first aerial photograph appeared on the screen behind her. This image was taken 11 years ago, she said calmly. The judge looked up. Randall looked up. Everyone looked up. There was my property. There was my house. There was my front yard. And there was no driveway. Just grass. Melissa clicked again. A photograph from 10 years ago appeared. Still no driveway. Click. 9 years ago. Grass. Click. 8 years ago. Grass. Click. 7 years ago. Grass. The room became noticeably quieter with every image. Nobody was speaking anymore. Even Randall's attorney seemed uncomfortable. Melissa continued moving through the timeline year by year, letting the photographs tell the story. 6 years ago, grass. 5 years ago, grass. Then finally, 4 years ago, construction equipment appeared. Temporary barriers. Building materials. The beginning of the renovation. Another click. Fresh concrete. Another click. A completed driveway. The very driveway sitting on my property today. Melissa lowered the remote and looked toward the judge. Your Honor, the driveway first came into existence approximately 4 years ago. Mr. Bishop has testified under oath that he has been using it for at least 10 years. The silence that followed felt enormous. Judge Brennan slowly removed his glasses and studied the photographs again. Then he turned toward Randall. I will never forget the expression on Randall's face. For weeks he'd carried himself like a man holding a winning hand. For months he'd acted as though this entire situation was inevitable, as though I would eventually be forced to surrender and accept his version of reality. Now, for the first time, he looked uncertain. The judge folded his hands and spoke in the calmest voice imaginable. Mr. Bishop, he paused. You cannot possess a historical right to something that did not exist. That's it. No dramatic speech. No shouting. No courtroom theatrics. Just one sentence. One sentence that destroyed the entire case. I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Across the room, Randall's attorney looked like a man reconsidering several life choices simultaneously. He leaned toward his client and whispered something. Randall didn't respond. He just stared at the photographs. The judge spent another few minutes reviewing the remaining documents. The property deed confirmed exclusive ownership. The survey confirmed the driveway sat entirely within my boundaries. No easements existed. No shared access agreements existed. No legal basis existed for the claim. Finally, Judge Brennan delivered his ruling. The lawsuit was dismissed in its entirety. Every claim, every demand, every argument, gone. Then came the part one wasn't expecting. The judge addressed Randall directly. He explained that courts rely on truthful representations and that filing claims unsupported by facts waste judicial resources. He stopped short of imposing harsher penalties, but his warning was unmistakable. Then he ordered Randall to reimburse my legal expenses. That announcement hit harder than anything else. You could practically see the calculation happening behind Randall's eyes. Attorney fees aren't theoretical. They're real. They arrive in actual numbers. And unlike imaginary historical rights, those numbers exist. When the hearing ended, Melissa gathered her files and smiled. Told you facts were facts. I laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks. Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking apart. Sunlight was starting to push through. It sounds dramatic, but that's genuinely how it felt. Like a storm ending. Not because of the driveway. Not because of the lawsuit. Because the entire situation had been exhausting. For months, I dealt with accusations, paperwork, uncertainty, and a neighbor who seemed determined to turn common sense into a legal battle. And now it was finally over. Or so I thought. The next morning, I was sitting on my porch drinking coffee when I saw Randall's truck approaching from down the street. Out of pure habit, I watched. He slowed as he reached the entrance to my driveway. For a moment, he just sat there. Maybe he was thinking about the lawsuit. Maybe he was thinking about the judge. Maybe he was thinking about the bill he was about to receive. Whatever was going through his mind, something had clearly changed. Instead of turning into my driveway, he stopped completely. He hesitated. Then he backed up, shifted gears, and drove all the way to the actual cul-de-sac at the end of the road. The route he'd been avoiding for years. I watched until he disappeared around the corner. Then I took another sip of coffee and smiled. Not because I had beaten him. Honestly, that's the part people get wrong about situations like this. Winning wasn't satisfying because Randall lost. Winning was satisfying because the truth mattered. Boundaries mattered. Ownership mattered. Respect mattered. If someone asks for a favor, you can choose to give it. If someone treats your kindness like an obligation, eventually they stop receiving the kindness. That's the lesson I learned. And here's the part I'm still curious about today. If I had never put up that sign, would Randall have kept using the driveway forever? Would his children have started using it too? Would future owners have believed the same story? I honestly don't know. Maybe that's why this whole thing still sticks with me years later. So let me ask you this. Was I right to put an end to it when I did? Or should I have simply ignored it and let the neighbors keep using the driveway? Have you ever dealt with someone who confused your generosity with permission? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely want to hear where you stand on this one. And if you enjoy real stories about property disputes, neighborhood drama, legal karma, and ordinary people standing up for themselves the right way, make sure you subscribe and stick around for the next story.